Hi, this is Pat McDonald, your host for Vote for Vermont, where our tagline is Listening Beyond the Soundbites. Joining me this evening is Eric LaMontagne, who's the Executive Director. I was almost going to say Executive Vice President. That sounds even better.
More words.
Exactly. Executive Director of Campaign for Vermont. And our guests tonight, we have two guests. We have David Mears, who's the newly appointed Executive Director for the Audubon Vermont. And joining him is Gwendolyn Causer, who's, you have a very long title, Teacher, Naturalist, and Communications Manager for Audubon Vermont. Welcome to the show, David.
Thank you.
David's a repeat performer here. He was on when he was with the state government.
Correct,
Yeah.
yes.
So we always ask, as you know, people introduce themselves to our guests. And maybe, David, if we could start with you and who you are and a little bit of your background and
Sure.
why you went to Audubon.
Well, thanks. Yeah, no, I'm currently the executive director at Audubon, as you said. But before that, I've had a career kind of in and out of public service and teaching. Most recently, I was the head of the environmental law programs at Vermont Law School. And before that, I worked for the state of Vermont. I was the commissioner for the Department of Environmental Conservation. Right. But I've also had jobs in state government in Texas and in the state of Washington. Right. And I did a stint in Washington, D.C. Everyone needs to do a tour of duty there, so
maybe,
some
time. Or just visiting. That's good. Oh, that's great. Well, we're glad you're here. And just how did you segue into Audubon? Because I must say, I was a little surprised from the law school to the Audubon, but I know from talking to you, you're thrilled you made that leap.
I really am. It's an exciting time for Audubon. It's, I think, one of those unpolished gems in the state of Vermont. And I was hoping to be part of an organization that could really be in this moment where I feel like we have to come together as a state and as a nation around protecting our natural resources. Right. And Audubon feels like a really perfect organization to do that work.
That's great. Gwen, same thing, a little bit about yourself?
Yes, so I've been teaching for Audubon for over 10 years now. So I teach education programs for preschoolers all the way up to senior citizens on topics that range from maple sugaring to, of course, birds. Right. I came at it from a love of botany. So really our foundational concept is to connect people with nature. And so my connection wasn't actually birds when I came to Audubon. Oh. And, but I've come to really appreciate it. And it's a really very high interest topic for people to connect to.
And before Audubon,
Before Audubon, so I was working at for University of Vermont for the Department of Plant and Soil Science, doing integrated pest management with apple growers.
Oh, excellent! Mm-hmm. Very nice. We had. I'm trying to remember, 1,200 variety of apples in this state.
Sounds
something
likely.
Staggering like that. I had Ensign Tebbets on, and I said, what a great thing to have a contest. See if you could name 1,200 apples. Yeah. He never took me up on it. So anyway, so Eric.
Yeah, so Audubon, it's kind of a household term. I think everybody at some point or the other has heard it. But can you just give us a brief rundown of what is Audubon Vermont? How does it relate to the National Audubon, and just your elevator speech?
Yeah. Well, I'll take a first one at it, and
Go
then
ahead.
Gwen, who's much more of a veteran, can. This is a test to see if I've got it right. But
there you go.
Audubon actually has a really rich history as an organization nationally. It goes all the way back to the end of the 19th century, when there was a plummeting populations of birds for a whole variety of reasons, including the fact that they were being killed to make hats and decorate clothing. But the National Audubon Society kind of came up after many of the local chapters and state organizations formed. But Audubon Vermont has a rich history as part of the National Audubon Society. Not all the state Audubon organizations are, but ours is a state where we're connected to that national organization. But we also have a very deep connection to a series of chapters, which are community-based organizations which do a lot of work in terms of bird conservation and bird education and a whole lot of those kinds of different experiences. So what have I left out?
Well, we have an Audubon Center. So the Green Mountain Audubon Center is located in Huntington, Vermont. And that's where we base our education programs We do outreach from there, but most of the time school kids come to us for education programs.
And you have like 225 acres, a huge parcel of land.
Yeah, so not only
Yeah.
is it a large parcel, but there's a lot of different types
Stuff
of
happening.
habitats there. We have
Oh, nice.
beaver ponds and a sugaring operation that we have there. So
And is it something you can walk around and experience?
yes,
Oh,
yes,
great.
miles and miles.
I was
of
gonna
trails.
say-
I'm ashamed I haven't been there.
Every spring we come for Maple Weekend.
Oh, yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
My
Yeah,
girlfriend
Sugar
and
on
I,
snow
and we
parties.
come and do the sugar on snow parties and
Okay.
hike all the trails with the dogs out
Yep.
behind there.
Oh.
Fantastic
It's on
time.
my list now. That's great.
And, and to add on to that, another reason to come out that way is we're right adjacent to the Birds of Vermont Museum, which is this incredible collection of hand-carved birds, which are set in various kinds of habitats. But it's an incredible teaching opportunity and learning experience for anyone who wants to go learn
Nice.
more about Vermont's birds.
Or if you
Excellent.
just appreciate artistry, I mean,
Oh my God.
amazing
Yeah, it's-
details on those models. It's
Oh,
incredible.
Cool. I have to get out more. You know, we'd camp in Maine, and I've seen everything in Maine. Here, it's just, I think it's normal. Here in Vermont, you're telling me stuff I haven't been to. Shame on me. But if we were vacationing here, we'd see it, right?
Exactly.
It's very sad. Anyway, David, you were quoted after when you were named the executive director, and it's a long quote, but I'm going to zip through it. The work of protecting our wild places from our mountains to our rivers while ensuring the continued ecological health and vitality of our working forests and fields has never been more important for birds and all species, including humans. And you mentioned this a little bit before when you were talking about your background. Why did you say it has never been more important? And why is it now is the important time? What do we need to know?
There's been a confluence of issues or I don't know what to describe them as, characteristics of this moment that include the decline of species as a result of the loss of habitat, the kind of unmanaged and non-strategic kinds of ways in which we humans have lived on the landscape. And for birds, it matters not just the way we behave here in Vermont, it matters how we behave as humans in Canada and South America and in Texas and all these different places, because birds don't recognize borders.
Right.
So as you think about the globe and the global environmental challenges we face, you can imagine that our bird species are under great threat. Another issue is that we are at a point of really political failure. We have as a country, and I think Vermont is doing much better than certainly we are as a nation. But even in Vermont, there are ways in which we could be really much more proactively and strategically engaging in protecting the habitats and the environmental conditions and the ecological health of our systems. And the birds are in some ways the canary in the coal mine that represent the risks that we face. So those are the things that have caused me to feel like there's an important role for an organization like Audubon Vermont as part of the National Audubon Society to play in trying to figure out how do we develop long-term strategies that we can sustain, that really are nonpartisan, non-ideological
Right.
solutions that we can support over the long term.
Right. Oh. Ooh.
I know.
Well, that'll wake them up. I would surprised that some places aren't associated with the national, because I would think you would want that extra level of oversight, and I'm sure they're the ones that do a lot of testifying in Washington, D.C., and keep track of those folks, what they're up to. And we're going to talk about the changes in the law that you had wanted to talk about. But I would just think you'd want that extra,
Well, it was
that
certainly
extra oversight and influence, and there's a strength in numbers.
exactly. No, it was actually a big part of the appeal for me of being associated with Audubon
Yeah,
Vermont was
right.
to be connected to that national
Yeah, I would
organization.
think so. Yeah, cool. Okay.
Let's go back to the education side of things. I know I get your emails all the time. It's good to put a face to the name.
Yeah.
Tell us a little bit about what programs you offer. I know you guys do a lot with birds and put out some amazing materials. I know I see Pat's got her.
Oh, I brought
her
my book, and
book,
I was
her,
talking before the show about, and I'm hoping that they'll spend a few minutes talking about what's available, and maybe after the question we can talk about all of the different books and stuff that are available. But sorry.
But yeah, run us through the scope of your educational programs.
Okay, so sort of a nice way to think about it is how kids can start engaging from a very early age, and as as they get older, just how that engagement deepens, and they really learn how to take action and be agents of change for environmental action. So at the very youngest, we have a free nature play group. So kids are coming with their caregivers to learn how to be comfortable in nature, and it's not always something that comes easily.
Yeah.
So they're out there modeling how to be in nature, how to ask questions about what you're seeing, how to make connections between what's going on right in front of you and what's going on a bigger scale. We have a forest play school. So this is a drop-off program where there's a community of preschoolers that are learning together, and it's very interest-driven. So they set the agenda for what they're going to do and what they're going to discover, and it's very play-based. So they're having a great time out there. They're
Right.
outside all day long,
Right.
and so in all year round. So really immersed in nature.
Really? In snow?
Oh yeah.
That's
Oh,
good.
really?
Yeah.
Good for
Snow,
them.
rain.
Good for you.
They
Yeah.
love the puddles in the rain.
Oh, that's great.
Well, you've probably heard the phrase that there's an outdoor deficit, in terms of our
For sure,
children
right.
who are attached to their electronic devices and not getting out enough.
Right.
And my own sense as a parent has been that part of the reason that I feel my own children value the outdoors and value the natural world and a lot of the traditions we have here in Vermont was because they've gotten out and experienced it. And
Right.
part of our goal is to help parents with that challenge, to help get children outside, to be comfortable with it and to value it.
Right. That's great. Well, I'm sure you must do a lot of nature hikes and.
Absolutely, and it's interesting you mentioned that because my very first connection with Audubon was with my daughter when she was a preschooler.
Oh, perfect.
So we used to come to those preschool programs every month and all the family programs, and that's how I learned how to be comfortable in nature as a parent.
So when you're looking at your preschool, your elementary, your high school, and then you've got some for us, you even said seniors. I'll
Yes.
have to find out about that. That's
Yep.
me. But how do you make them age appropriate, I guess? How can you, what I'm saying? I mean, what would interest a high school kid
Right.
may or may not interest the
Exactly.
preschooler, and you've got, especially high school, you've got to keep them
You do.
fascinated at all times. otherwise
Yeah.
they're gone.
And it's interesting because my daughter is in college now,
Oh.
and so as she moved through it, it became so much easier to understand how to connect
Right.
with that age. So before she went through middle school, I found those middle schoolers a little intimidating.
Yes, well, yes.
And they're some of my favorite kids to work with now.
Yeah.
Just gotta, kind of connect with their humor. You've got to connect with where they're at, and
Well, they're mini
just like the preschoolers.
Yeah.
You got to see where their interests are, and really engage them in a way that they can connect to.
So what keeps the high schoolers interested?
What keeps the high schoolers interested? A lot of it is data driven, so
Oh.
really engaging them to be developing their skills in terms of monitoring and using real life
great.
tools. We use, I know that you're interested in the bird friendly maple
Right,
program.
right.
So we've used, so our conservation biologist goes out and monitors and assesses habitat for the sugar bush.
Oh.
And so what we've done is kind of scaled that down for a high school level. So they're doing an assessment of a
Great.
sugar bush. And so they're getting the skills that they would need to go out and work as a professional.
Awesome. That's
very
great.
cool.
David, talk a little bit about what you saw outside your window today when you're talking about
Oh,
the
it's
kids.
true.
That's so cute. Right.
Well, I was just describing how I've got the perfect job out working in this beautiful old house in the middle of the woods. But as I was in the middle of a meeting today going over budget numbers, a whole gaggle of 3, 4-year-olds came by carrying pumpkins that they cut in half to turn into bird feeders.
Oh, that's so cool.
And that was
I
just
love it.
fun. But I wanted to add on, if I could,
Oh, absolutely.
to Gwen's point about how you reach different ages. There are some things that I'm observing are universal, absolutely universal across all age groups. And in some ways, the real strength of our organization is not only that we have expert educators like Gwen, but we have these amazing conservation scientists. And one of the things they can do, for instance, is take a group of children or adults or high schoolers out to catch birds, to band them,
Oh.
to catch them in these mist nets. The birds are not injured or hurt. They're very carefully handled by one of our experts, like Mark Labar. And they will get to actually see the bird close up, to hold it, to feel how vulnerable it is and how delicate, yet learn its story about how this tiny little bird, was hatched in, or may have traveled during some point in its life all the way down to Central or South America.
Right, the migration. Right, that's great. You have a, you're on.
I have what?
You have a question.
Oh, yes. Sorry, I
I
lost
know.
track. I was so enthralled by
I
this.
know, it's
But
terrible. It's
if
hard
I
to
could
keep
just
track.
to continue on that vein a little bit. Now, it sounds like you're mentioning a lot of programs and long-term things where families can go and have these immersive experiences for their children or even for themselves. Do you do day programs as well if a family's looking to go do something fun outside on a nice Saturday?
Yes, we do. And actually, a lot of the school groups that come are just there for the day. So, I'm talking about the more immersive ones where they get to come back over time because they're so much more fun because you get to connect with the students and, see their learning develop. But a lot of what we do is just a one-time sort of thing. So we do have public events and for people of all ages. So we do things like wildlife photography workshops. We do mushroom foraging workshops. We have tracking programs for all ages. Debbie has been running a series of programs called Starry Night, so programs at night looking at the night sky.
Oh, nice.
And so just really, getting folks comfortable with nature,
And that's
connecting
a whole
them in a
family
way.
thing.
Absolutely.
What a great way to spend time with your family.
Yeah.
It's awesome.
Yeah. And I'm going to continue to put you in the spotlight here, Gwen.
Long time.
But a little bit of a different topic here. I know through your bio it says that your first interest is with botany, and that's something you're very passionate about. And you've done a lot of work studying rare plants in Vermont. Tell us about that.
About the rare plants.
About the rare plants.
Yeah. Well, I can't tell you exactly where they are. But so the New England Wildflower Society coordinates surveys of rare plants and tracks them throughout New England. So I volunteer for them as part of their plant conservation volunteers. And so what happens is you'll get a survey and you'll say, oh, well, this particular plant was seen in this place 10 years ago. Can you go find out if it's still there? So it's kind of the needle in a haystack kind of situation. And so we go out with teams of volunteers. And actually Warren King from our board does a lot of wonderful work with rare plant surveys. He's found, oh my goodness, he was telling me how many populations of Jacob's ladder.
Oh, really?
And which was not seen in Vermont. They didn't realize how many populations there were, but hundreds of populations now he's discovered and is documented.
Nice. We have some ugly plants too, plants that cause...
Invasive plants?
Yes,
oh, are you
those-
thinking of the poison parsnip?
Yes, that I've
Yeah,
seen
that's
way too much of
problematic.
that, thank you very much.
Yeah,
It's
that
really
actually,
horrible.
my first connection to New England Wildflower Society was in monitoring invasive plants.
Yeah.
And so
Yeah, this
it's nice
plant
to get the other side of
causes
things.
giant welts on your
it's
wherever
terrible.
Yeah,
you
it's phyto-
touched it or breathed it or whatever. I don't know.
And is Vermont a place do we have a lot of rare plants? That sounds kind of weird when you say it that way, but I mean, is Vermont a place where has a lot of supporting habitat for these plants?
There is. I mean, because of the soils in Vermont, there's a lot of calcareous species that grow here, so that you wouldn't see in New Hampshire because of their soils. So it does have a lot of diversity.
Cool. So, and do you guys work with the Wildflower Society? Is that part of your outreach group?
We haven't had many formal partnerships with them.
Oh.
They actually, this past year, they did have a series of native plant workshops that we
nice.
helped to promote for them.
Excellent.
So yeah,
That's great.
they do
But
tremendous work.
Gwen's been really instrumental for us in helping to bring together this issue of plants and birds,
Right.
which has, as you might imagine, they're intimately connected. So
Yeah.
having the right kinds of plantings
Right.
and encouraging native plants and discouraging or removing invasive plants can make a huge difference to bird populations.
Well, you've got we were going to talk about it a little bit later, but you have a section on your website, which I must say, Gwen apparently does the website. It's excellent. You really should check it out. It's got so much information, but you talk about what plants should be planted to support the kind of birds you have in your area. So, very good. That's good.
Yeah,
I
and
have to-
there's a database I want to mention. So
Oh.
the National Audubon Society 2 years ago launched a native plant database. So you can enter your zip code and it will generate a list of native plants that are specifically geared towards where you live.
Oh, I love, excellent. So I wanted to show you, I asked my husband, do we have an Audubon book? And he came up with this book that was printed in 1977, which is a few years old. And it's, the pictures are just, birds are birds, and they're just stunning, stunning pictures. But you were telling me how many different types of books and stuff are available, e-birds, you were talking, could you just explain all the stuff that's available to us?
Sure. It was actually it was a learning experience for me as I've stepped back into the organization. I have like a 3-volume set of birds that I've had that my grandmother got me
nice.
many years ago, that I've used as kind of my go-to.
Yeah.
But when I joined Audubon, I got bombarded with all of these different invitations to different websites, and I've gone and checked them out. And National Audubon Society itself has a very strong, robust set of information about birds. You can go find a bird. Actually, it will walk you through, this software application will walk you through. You put in the characteristics. It was, bigger than a chickadee, but smaller than a dove, or it was, the size of a duck, and it was this color, and I found it on the ground. Whatever it is, and
Nice.
it will start to give you choices and lead you right to that bird.
Cool.
And then when you click on the bird, you can hear the sounds of the bird and all the different kind of plumages that it has at different stages of life, where it lives and breeds.
Super.
And that's the National Audubon Society site. There's also the Cornell Lab of Ornithology has a really terrific
Yeah.
site, and there's the one that you mentioned,
The
eBirds.
eBird, what is that? You were talking about that. Talk a little bit about the eBird.
So eBird is it is sort of crowdsourced data. So there's so many people out there observing birds, and so it's really helpful to scientists if you can upload your data about what birds you're seeing when you go out and you're bird watching.
Oh, great.
And so then all of that data is available to scientists to use for their research.
Awesome. Do you do that bird counting? Is that part of what
Oh,
you
yeah.
do? Are you the lead sponsors of that bird counting day?
So there's the Christmas bird count that
Yeah.
happens around Christmas time, and there are circles that have been going on for hundreds of years. That's the longest running bird monitoring
Wow.
event in the country. And then there's the Great Backyard Bird Count that Audubon is
Right,
part of that
right.
happens in February, which is very flexible and really easy to participate in. You can do it out your window if you'd like to. You can go out for hours if you'd like to. It's over a 4-day period.
Oh, nice.
Yeah.
Excellent. What fun.
And that's a place where our chapters, the Audubon chapters, come into play because there's a lot of citizen volunteers that
Sure.
go out and do bird counting. And there's also organizations that are not part of Audubon, but we're partnered with and work with all the time. Like here in Washington County, the North Branch Nature Center is a tremendous source of information and work on birds. And they do bird counts. They recently held some nighttime owl banding
Oh,
events.
you should come to my backyard. We've got some owl makes so much noise. It's so cool,
yeah.
along with the coyotes. But let's not talk about them. They're around all over the place, aren't they, coyotes?
Yes.
Is this like I know this isn't in your bailiwick, but are they new? They're not new to Vermont, but there just seems to be everywhere this year.
Well, there's some interesting population dynamics around coyotes that relate to, actually go back to the production of by trees of larger amounts of acorns or
Oh,
seeds
really?
that then generate larger amounts of squirrels and mice and other turkeys and critters that eat them. And then the predators, then their populations then grow shortly after as they have more game. But coyotes were not actually a widespread species in the Northeast until the wolves were driven out, and then they gradually migrated from the west.
Left an opening for them.
Exactly.
So excited about that. When you're out walking your dog at night, you do not want to hear that sound because you have no clue where they are. They sound like they're right next to you. We run back to the house, but anyway.
Yeah, I hear them all the time out deer
I know,
hunting.
it
It's a
scares
little
me to
eerie when
death.
it's
Yeah.
pitch black and you can tell they're only a few hundred yards away.
So, anyway, I've got to ask you. You put on your website, David, about working lands, which remind me of the working landscape that we talk about in Vermont. What does that mean to you in the Audubon world, working lands?
Well, one of the great assets that Vermont has in terms of the way that we live on the land is that we do still have lots of open space. And birds and wildlife and frankly, humans all benefit from having lands that are maintained in that open state. And it doesn't matter necessarily that they're used in some way. You know, good forestry practices, good farming practices are very constant with having wildlife and a healthy natural environment, which has so many benefits, from clean water to clean air to flood resilience and all of that. So when I think about working lands, I'm thinking about the ways in which we in Vermont can continue to sustain a strong forest economy, a strong agricultural economy, a strong outdoor recreation economy, the kinds of things that keep people invested in the idea of all of this open space.
That's great, and we sure have it. It's beautiful here, isn't it? It's just great. How much does the water quality here affect what you must be really watching that closely? The water quality for birds and animals.
It's true. They're very connected, and it's an area that, as you may recall, it's an area where I've spent a lot of my career working, and so I'm very interested in looking at opportunities to grow the ways in which we look at the intersection between healthy rivers and streams and wetlands and floodplains and bird habitat and bird conservation.
Right. Yeah, because we cover the Lake Champlain cleanup a lot on this show. Anyway, sorry I threw that in.
Well, no, I mean, it's an important topic that really affects
I don't think birds do well
everything.
with dirty water. Yeah.
Exactly. So we talked about rare plants a little bit. Let's talk about some rare animals. I know Vermont does see some endangered bird species. What are those? How are they doing? What is Audubon doing to support those species?
Well, it's interesting, there's a set of laws at the state level and the federal level that most people have heard about. The Endangered Species Act exists at the federal level. And there's some great successes in Vermont of birds that used to be on the endangered species list but have been taken off the federal list. The bald eagle, the peregrine falcon, both species that were terribly impacted by the loss of habitat and prey and by DDT, the application of that pesticide. And they've now recovered to a point where they're no longer on the national endangered species list. But those are also examples of birds that we have continued to pay attention to at the state level. So we have a really terrific group of folks led by Lewis Porter, the Commissioner of Fish and Wildlife, and John Buck, who's the head of his bird conservation efforts, do really a terrific job of supporting and working with us in our efforts. For instance, we've had a long-term program to protect peregrine falcons and their cliff sites to make sure that they're undisturbed and can thrive. Also, we've done a lot of work out on Lake Champlain to protect the common tern, another species that's been...
Oh, so is that a lake bird? A bird that's... Because I honestly didn't know what that was.
Yeah.
So I was going to ask what the
it's got the
tern
name
is.
common right in its name, but
common.
it's not that common.
I don't know.
Yeah.
What is the common tern?
It's a beautiful white bird that had the misfortune of being so attractive that it was turned into women's hats back at the turn of the 20th century. And but it's through restoration efforts. It's largely recovered, and there are a set of islands on Lake Champlain. I've had the privilege of going to visit some of those with Mark Labar, who's our conservation scientist. And what we do is make sure, essentially, protect them from human degradation and human contact. Although we also, there's some increasing populations of some other birds, like cormorants, that have been a threat to the common tern. So there's been some balancing of management to protect that particular species.
Excellent. You also have a list of what you call priority birds, which must be the next level down, I guess, from the extinct birds. What's the difference between those two categories, and who's on that?
There's some overlap in that in fact, many of the birds that are on Audubon's priority list are also protected under federal and state law, but not necessarily. For instance, but they're birds that Audubon as an organization has identified that they are threatened because with either extinction or a decline in population, or they may be an indicator of some overall larger trends in terms of the health of the ecosystem that we need to pay attention to. But a bird, for instance, that is here in Vermont, that's not threatened in Vermont, it's not particularly rare, is the black-throated blue warbler. But it's protected in part because nationally it is under some pressure and stress. And Vermont's one of the central places that it lives. So we're kind of an important place to protect its habitat.
Because if they grow here, they're here.
Exactly.
And the thrush was on that list. We can't lose the thrush, because that's our state bird, isn't it?
Oh, the hermit thrush,
The
of
hermit
course.
thrush,
Yes,
This
yes.
is the wood thrush, though. That's different. right? The wood thrush is on your list.
Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
See, my husband was very impressed that I knew that the hermit thrush the other day. So anyway,
So well, maybe this is a good transition then, since we're talking about migratory birds now, to give you your opportunity to talk about some of these new changes to the Migratory Bird Treaty Act.
Well, thank you so much. Yeah,
Yeah.
no, that's a great question, and it protects not just it protects the vast majority of songbirds and just birds generally across Vermont and across the country. And there was, as I've mentioned a couple of times now, there were a whole set of threats that were impacting migratory birds that revolved mostly around hunting and
Right.
trading in their meat or in the feathers. But there's been, so the Migratory Bird Treaty Act made it a crime to kill a bird. And it was a way of fulfilling a set of treaties, international treaties we had with countries like Canada and Russia and Japan. But birds, as you know, continued to have threats. In the kind of post-World War II industrialization of our country, there were a lot of threats, chemical threats, destruction of habitat. And so the federal government began to enforce the Migratory Bird Treaty Act in the 60s and 70s for activities that caused that weren't necessarily hunting, but caused the destruction of bird habitat. And it's that portion of the law and its interpretation that has been recently pulled back, reinterpreted by the national government. So there's really a broad-based bipartisan effort nationally among conservation groups and others to try to put back in place those protections.
I don't disagree with that. I was very surprised to, what's their rationale for that, other than helping businesses? Is that sort of
The biggest push as I understand it, has for an advocacy for pulling back the interpretation of the law has been from the oil and gas industry. It's apparently fairly expensive for them to implement some of the protections that are needed to keep
Right.
birds out from being harmed from the oil and gas facilities and their disposal lagoons and so forth. So it's I think that's part of it. There actually is, though, there's been room for improvement of this law. You can imagine that a law that was passed in 1918 may not work as well in
Sure, right,
2018. And there are ways in which we could improve it. So I've started engaging in Vermont with some conversations with people who may be interested in this to see if we can't develop our own version in Vermont at least.
right?
We can't replace the protections in Louisiana or other states, but
States' rights.
but we can do what we can
Right.
do in our own state, and to see if there aren't ways that we can't put in place an even better system, a more up-to-date modern system for protecting birds.
I have a horrible story which I will share. I worked for a big chemical company which shall remain nameless, and at one of their plants down south, they had these big, you call them oil pits. They had these big open pits where they were cleaning out the chemical waste, so that by the end of the 3 or 4 pools down, it was clean. This is really awful. And the birds, if they flew too low over the first and second pits, which were just highly toxic, they didn't make it across. They just, and it was horrible. I mean, just horrible to stand there and watch this. And this law would have made them do something about that.
Exactly.
Because, they just missed it by, they just came down a little too low and gone. It was just terrible. Anyway, I digress.
Well,
But
it
that just
Well,
that's
no,
stuck in
that's-
my
that's
head. That's
exactly
stuck
what
in
we're
my
talking
head
about.
for
Yeah.
years. This was a long time ago.
traumatizing to
No,
watch
it's
all
terrible.
day.
It's like,
So if I can ask too, along this Migratory Bird Treaty Act, you guys brought up earlier the issue of cormorants, which is a big issue on Lake Champlain. So where is the balance between protecting species under the Migratory Bird Treaty Act, but also protecting local natural resources when a protected species may not only be destructive but also threaten other bird species and have conflicts with other protected species such as the tern?
Yeah, no, conflict is one of the most difficult issues, and Gwen, I'd love for you to weigh in, on this as well. But it's a challenge for all of us who care about these creatures to think about that we may, in fact, in some instances, need to kill or terminate one critter to protect another. But those are tough choices. They're made based on science when we're involved in them to look at where's there a species, for instance, the cormorant, that's thriving, that really the taking of some of those birds, or to prevent them from reproducing. You know, one of the most common ways to control cormorants is to put oil on their eggs to prevent them from hatching. That's warranted because there are other species like the common tern that are quite threatened, or more at the edge of survival. And those are tough choices to make, but those are the kinds of decisions that we think an organization like Audubon needs to be involved in discussing, because presumably no one will question the fact that our organization cares deeply about protecting the overall ecological health of birds and
maintaining
bird
the
habitat.
balance. So
Yeah,
It's
but Gwen,
hard.
do you
No,
want to
I
add
think-
anything?
Yeah, I think that covers it well.
Thanks.
So I saw on your website you have a list of projects. We're going to get to that question later on about how do you all do this, but it's really staggering what you have on your plate, I'm just saying. But you've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6 major projects, and maybe if I could just list them and then you could talk about 1 or 2 of them. The Bird-Friendly Maple Project, the reason I brought that is anything with maple's got to be good. The Golden-Winged Warbler, oof, that's a tough word, warbler. Coalition Project?
The geolocation.
Geolocation.
Yeah, so tracking where they're
Yeah,
going.
and Woods Wildlife and Warbler Project, the Bobolink Project. I didn't know we had bobolinks here. Forest Bird Initiative and the Champlain Valley Bird Initiative. So jump right in, pick a project.
Well, there are many of those kind of intersect with each other. For instance, like the Bird-Friendly Maple and the Forest Bird Initiative are connected. Maybe I'll take a run at that, and then
Sure. Yeah,
you
go
can
ahead.
take a run at a couple of the other ones.
Say
But
the word warbler again. I can't say it. I'll find another name for that.
But we have one of our conservation scientists, Steve Hagenbu, is just highly knowledgeable both about forestry and about birds and bird ecology. And he's been working on a program, Foresters for the Birds, as an example of kind of the Forest Bird Initiative, in which our team will work together with foresters to help them understand the variable options that they have for managing their forest that may be healthy both in terms of producing an income from the forest and meeting your current use requirements to get the property tax relief, but at the same time creating new bird habitat. For instance, some birds really thrive on that mix of being in a forest stand but in a small field or opening.
Cool.
Other birds like younger forests with smaller trees and shrubs in them. And so managing for that, what the foresters call structure, to have multiple levels of structure in a forest, which was what you would see in a natural, forest that was untouched by humans in any event. So working with landowners and foresters to kind of recreate that is a way of both benefiting those landowners and supporting wildlife and birds. So Steve has done that work with landowners, with foresters, and with maple producers, because it turns out that there are also ways that you can make a good return on your investment in terms of getting good maple syrup off of your land and also promote good, healthy
Excellent.
bird habitat. And the benefit to the maple producers is that they get a beautiful label from us that says this is bird-friendly maple syrup. And so consumers that are buying that particular brand of maple syrup
Well,
know
that
that.
adds to the brand, doesn't it?
Exactly.
That's great.
Exactly.
I love this.
So Gwen,
Yes,
maybe
yeah.
you want to talk about one of the other? Or
Sure.
Want
let's
to do
see
a
here.
bobolink project?
The bobolink project?
I love bobolinks.
Yes, so that's a grassland bird species, and the threat to the bobolinks is with early haying. If the farmers come in too early and the birds are still nesting there, then they don't survive. So the bobolink project, the way it works is that they collect donations to essentially underwrite the costs of that delaying the mowing for those farmers. And then, so they delay that mowing, and then the bobolinks are able to get off their young and fledge from those
Nice.
nests. And so it's supported by the public, and it's a collaboration between, which states are involved? Maine and
Massachusetts.
rather.
Massachusetts is the lead state on it,
Yep.
and I
and
believe
Vermont, and I thought it was 3 states. But
A couple of years ago, there was this issue. I don't know if it was with bobolinks, but at the airport here in central Vermont, where there were birds, exactly what you're talking about, and they had to cut the grass just to a certain height so that the birds would be, because you know, obviously if the planes took off and the birds take off, there's a problem, and then they would damage the nest. Do you remember, I just in the back of my head, it was a big deal here for a while.
No,
So some type of bird was living on the,
Sounds like maybe a killdeer.
I haven't, I don't
They
even know.
nest
if
right
that-
on the rocks, like
On
they
the
don't have
rocks?
any.
Oh.
No, but
No, it just-
I do recall, that's a good example of where you have to look at balancing, you
Yeah.
know, human impacts.
Right.
We don't want, you know, seagulls and birds nesting near
Right,
airports.
right.
It's not good for the birds, and it's certainly not
Certainly
good
not
for
good for the
those of
people
us who
on the
fly on
plane.
the planes.
Yeah,
So
right.
there are times in which mowing around those areas, because there's many bird species that
Yeah.
love shrub habitat. But the adverse of that question is that there are many places where people in Vermont own land, where they have fields that if they did not mow them, you know, if you don't need to mow it for your living, you're just mowing it for the aesthetics.
Yeah.
It's better to leave it
Leave it
unmowed
alone,
for the
right.
birds. And there, as Gwen can tell you, there's many beautiful
Right.
landscaping ways you can landscape your property that are really great
Right.
for birds, and will give you and your family the chance to see all sorts
Nice.
of amazing
This is
critters
getting
like.
me very excited.
Well,
to-
and that scheme also ties into a lot of water quality work as well. Getting rid
Absolutely.
of leaving your lawn longer, adding some of those you know, permeable surfaces goes a long way with water quality as well.
Absolutely true.
Yeah, and choosing to plant native plants, they're not going to need the inputs, the fertilizer inputs that
Right.
that non-natives do.
Cool.
Absolutely.
Excellent.
So your organization is what's the term here? Important bird areas of Vermont. Have identified some of those. Can you tell us a little bit about what those are, what qualifies as an important area, and also maybe bring it back to if a homeowner or a landowner has some areas that they think are important, if there's a way to work with you folks on helping them protect their own land.
That's a good.
Yeah, that's a great question, and the important bird areas intersects with the priority birds in that we identify important bird areas that are kind of habitats that are of a nature that are important to that particular bird species survival. And then what the biologists and conservation scientists do is they identify where there are large areas of either existing habitat that should be protected, that are already in a state that's, you know, promotes healthy bird populations, or where it could be if that was restored because it's under threat or it's been changed in
Right.
some way. And then what we use that information to do is to organize our own work, so that when we're recruiting landowners to participate in programs, or we're doing education and outreach, or we're doing additional public policy work, we try to focus and work together with, you know, the Fish and Wildlife Department and the Forest Parks and Recreation and Department of Environmental Conservation to figure out where are the most important critical places to invest in conservation programming.
Excellent. So is there like a number of how many of these critical areas that you have around? Or is the whole state just sort of identified as?
Nope. So on the website there is a list of the important
Oh, there
bird
is. Oh, I
areas
didn't
that were
see
identified.
Oh,
I
shame on
believe
me.
19. It's
Oh,
definitely in
really?
the teens
19.
throughout
That's-
the state.
Sounds
Cool.
about right. And I think this will probably trigger your memory of some other issues, because it's been a hot issue in the legislature and in the state of Vermont for a while, which is the issue of forest fragmentation.
Oh, yes.
There are a lot of these important bird areas are important in part because they are interconnected, you know, large areas of
right.
forests that haven't been broken up by development. And so that's
Well,
another.
it's like the wetlands, and if you break it up,
Yes.
Yeah,
and
you need
it's
that.
better to be contiguous so that all the wildlife and animals and birds have a place to go. We're not messing their home up.
Exactly.
Cool.
And if a landowner finds that they fall within one of these important areas, can they reach out to you folks about things they can do to help make sure that their property maintains those standards?
Absolutely. No, in fact, that's one of the things that we get most excited about is when landowners call us and say,
Great.
hey, we'd like to figure out how to manage our property to better protect birds.
Nice.
And we're not a regulatory agency, you know, we don't impose or enforce regulations. You know, we work with and collaborate with the state and support their efforts to do that. But a lot of our work that's done in this conservation arena is done in collaboration with landowners to help them do a better job. And what we have found is that most people really care deeply about birds. and they will begin, if they knew how, if they had the right information, they'll do a better job. So we've done this work with foresters. Gwen and I have talked about maybe doing some more outreach with landscapers, and I'd like to grow kind of the work that we do with the farming community, because I think there's
Nice.
many opportunities for landowners to do a lot that doesn't interfere with their own desire to use the land.
And I bet they'd love to learn this, because I can't imagine, you said it's not political, it's where we live and it's our environment. So we have to get it right. So I hate to bring this up, but I'm going to ask this question about climate change. That's such a big issue here in Vermont and everywhere. So what's your position from Audubon about climate change, and what should we be doing?
Yeah, well, that's the way you framed the question.
It was like,
I know kind of has a whole set of undercurrents to it, because at the surface of it, the question of what's our position on climate is, climate change is real, it's
Yeah,
happening,
right.
it's probably the single biggest threat to our bird populations
Right.
in this country today.
well, there's just so many, I said it that way because there's just so much back and forth and pros and cons, and people are not, think it's not real, people think it's real, but I would think because of your work, you must think it's real and we got to do something.
Absolutely,
Yeah.
that it's critical, and I know also part of the challenge has become it's become a political issue.
Right,
That there's been a set of questions about whether you believe in the science or not is somehow depends on which party you're in, which I think is ultimately a failing of our nation's leaders across the nonprofit, the business, and the public sector, because really there's plenty of room to disagree about how to respond to climate
Right.
change. Whether we need to respond to climate change, for anyone who's been in Vermont and had their eyes open, we've
Right.
lived through a major, we are now having an extreme flood event in this state every year. We've had at
Right.
least one federally declared flood disaster every year for the last 30 years.
Right.
So we're impacted by it. So the question really is both how do we respond and adapt to it, and what can we do to, offset
so
our
when you hear the word
contributions?
climate change with birds and the things that you've been asked to be responsible for, what do you have to look for to protect them? What's, is it the temperature? Is it the weather changing? Is it what? I guess I'm struggling with what.
Oh yeah, no, that's a
Or
great
is it
question.
all of the above?
It is all of the above.
Yeah.
I mean, part of what, there are bird species, like the bicknose thrush, that are high elevation species, that if we lose our high elevation habitats, they kind of don't have anywhere to go.
Right.
And so protecting, reducing everything we can do to mitigate and prevent climate change, small state though we are, is important. But it also means protecting as much of that habitat as we can so that they have safe places to recover. And the richer that habitat and the greater the opportunities and choices they have, the better the chance that they'll be able to adapt and
Right.
survive the change in climate. But there are also a whole set of ways in which we live on the landscape that if we do it in the right way, both benefit us, as humans and the way that we live, as well as benefit wildlife and birds and habitat. And one of the best examples that I've seen and know that makes a real difference is the way in which we protect wetlands, for instance. Wetlands are such a rich source of habitat, food,
Right.
and protection and for birds and wildlife, but they also are these filters and sponges that have water quality benefits and also protect us from floods downstreams. There's some really interesting, important work done after Irene in which we looked at the ways in which watersheds where we had protected wetlands fared so much better,
Wow.
had far less damage than they would have had if there hadn't been those protected wetlands. So that raises a whole set of interesting public policy questions about, well, how do we protect these resources in ways that are important for us as humans,
Right.
as well as for the birds and wildlife that
Yep.
live on them?
I know we've talked about removal of trees for construction, and so you get flooding in the soil and the habitat for birds. We've had some shows with Bill Sayer on the woodlands and.
Well, that's a great example. And the flip of that also is that by investing in our forests and our forest economy, we are storing carbon. Large
Right,
amounts
exactly.
of carbon dioxide are being stored
Yeah.
in our forests. A
Right.
good, strong, healthy forest in Vermont
Right.
isn't just good for birds, it's good for the climate and it's good for our economy.
Yeah, they're struggling right now in our forests. That's true. Very good.
So you guys do a great job on your website, and anybody who hasn't been to the website should go check it out. Listing tips for folks, what plants to plant and how to help owls and raptors after a snowstorm. We're moving into colder months. Birds are moving around. What are a few things that you can tell folks for the season?
Well, I mean, it's not technically too late to get native plants in the ground. So you think about winter being the best time for
Right.
bird feeding, but having native plants that are there providing food for birds year round is really a even stronger action to take than feeding birds.
So what kind of plants would that be?
What kind of plants? Plants that have nuts and berries in the winter are
okay.
really great. So things like serviceberry is wonderful. Hazelnut can be great.
Does it attract bears too?
It could attract bears. It could attract squirrels. So
Yeah.
when you're feeding the birds,
We have a
you're
little
also
bear problem in our backyard.
Ah,
so-
yes.
And they keep telling us take down the feeders. so-
exactly. Yeah, you don't want the
So this
feeders
is
up
better
until
in
the
my
bears
mind
are in.
because it's not feeders. It's
Yeah, it's
you know,
just
it's right there.
you're growing your bird
Yeah,
feeders out
right.
there.
Well, and I used to clear like my gardens in the fall. I
Oh,
thought
yeah.
that was what you're supposed to do, is clean up your garden. But I've now learned that by leaving, for instance, my purple coneflowers out, after they've died, over the winter, they turn out to be great food source for
Oh,
chickadees
really?
and other.
Oh,
All
I
those
love
seed heads are up
chickadees.
there. Yeah.
yeah, they're the cutest.
Yeah.
They're nice.
And the insects, that's the next step connection when we're teaching kids about plants for birds is, we're talking about the berries and the nuts, but insects are the other food group for birds because
Excellent. Let them eat them. I
they're-
know which one I'd like them to go for.
I planted some apple trees a few years back, and this summer my wife said, "There's these terrible caterpillars, or eating
Right,
your
right.
your apple tree." And I
Right.
went out and I thought, "Oh, I'm not going to spray any chemicals on them. So what am I going to do?" And by the time I had, I went back and Googled and looked up on the website to
Right.
see how to deal with it, and I was going to go out and basically, with some gloves on, pick them and squash them. But in the 24 hours between when I saw them the first day and went back, they had all been cleared out. And I'm not sure which bird it was.
Oh,
but
no kidding.
there was some fat little
Bring 'em
bird
on.
flying
yeah,
around.
it takes so many insects for birds to bring back to their nest to feed
Right, right.
their baby birds. So
All day
it's-
long,
yeah.
back and forth.
Another
Oh.
tip, it's relates to bird feeders, that if folks haven't already cleaned out, I'm not bird feeders, bird houses. Bird houses are a great way for people to promote bird habitat in their yards, and but a lot of people don't realize this. It's important to clean them out after the
okay.
season, and
Yeah.
to even disinfect them with a
You
light
said there's
bleach
some
solution.
information on how you help owls after a snowstorm. What, is that the wording?
Yeah, I noticed that on there, and I was
It said, how to help owls and other raptors after a snowstorm. Because I have
I'm a little
got the
stumped on
most
that one.
amazing owls. Oh, we don't know the
I
answer.
was like,
Whoa,
what
I'll have
is-
to look it
which
up. Well, I'll
piece-
look it up on the.
Yeah.
on-
We'll
on
have to
the
go. I'll go to the
I
website.
Yeah.
Because we have owls all over the place, and they just make the most amazing
Oh, they do.
sounds.
Yeah, it's
And
it's
I keep
wonderful
trying.
to
You
hear them
can't
talk
find
back.
them though. You look, but they're
Yeah.
hiding somewhere.
They're
but
well
anyway.
camouflaged.
Yeah, we're
and
sort of-
silent when they fly too.
Oh, when they fly?
Yeah.
Oh, great.
Now, there is an app, a software application you can use on your phone. I haven't used it myself, but I'm told that you can record the sound of those owls, for
Oh,
instance,
really?
and it will identify for you which
Oh,
species
I love
it
that.
is.
Oh, I'm going to do that
Yeah,
because they
that's-
are so loud and and especially on a clear night, they're like in your
It's
face.
probably a barred owl.
That's what my husband tells me.
Yeah.
I don't know this.
I had this amazing experience. I was coming down Honey Hollow. I don't know if you know Honey Hollow. It's kind of on the back side of the Duxbury side of Camel's Hump.
Yep.
Oh, it is.
And coming down from a grouse hunt down there, and off to right on the road, probably 20 feet away on a big branch, was this enormous owl. And it just sat there. I parked the truck, turned the engine off, and we just looked
Checking
at each
you
other
out.
for about 3 minutes, about 20 feet away from me. And I don't know, it looked like a gray owl. I know those are really
Oh, the
rare in
great
Vermont,
gray,
so
yeah.
it probably was
Was it in the
something
fall?
more common. It was just last week.
Oh.
And it was wasn't bothered by me at all.
So
It
bigger
was-
than a great horned owl? I
It
mean, great
was-
horned owls are,
It didn't have the horns that I noticed.
but they can put them down.
Oh, so maybe that. But it was amazing that we just looked at each
You
other.
didn't look threatening.
For about 10
Or he
minutes.
thought
Yeah.
he could take you, one of the two.
like,
There you go. So I do have to ask, I know we only have a couple minutes
Yeah.
left. I promised my mother I would ask this question. She lives on the Connecticut River, and she gets an amazing number of bird species that come up and down that flyway.
Yeah.
But she has not seen any grosbeaks in the last 3 years. Is that a species that's on the radar as one of concern, or is it just maybe she's missing them?
No, there's been a fairly dramatic downturn in the evening grosbeak, which for those of the viewers who haven't seen one, you should go online and look it up. It's a beautiful, beautiful bird. But yes, there's been a significant decline in the grosbeak species. I was actually just talking with our colleague Kim Gerton today about that very issue. But ironically enough, I received a call over the weekend from a gentleman who said he lives over, I think, in the Waitsfield area and has seen a tremendous number of evening grosbeaks. So it may be that there's been a shift
Maybe the habitat has changed.
in
or
their
something.
habitat.
Yeah.
But there is nationally, there has been a decline in that species. So your mother's not just imagining that.
Yeah.
That's great. Well, we only have 2 minutes left, so I want you to talk about the events that are coming up, because we've sort of covered the big question I was going to ask you is how the heck do you do this all? But I think you've sort of answered that with the volunteers and working with state departments and any
And
other
our
services?
chapters.
And the chapters,
Yes.
right? Because seriously, when you look at their website, you will be blown away. I now know what the Audubon Vermont does. It's very impressive, and we thank you very much. We talked about how you can help. I think raising your voice is one of them to our lawmakers. Do they ever get involved in things that you would be active in up in the State House? They must at some point.
Yes, and there's a lot of issues where Audubon Vermont's interests in bird habitat protection intersect with that of other conservation groups. So we do a lot of work in partnership with
That's great.
a number of groups, so the land trusts and
Oh,
groups
of
like the
course.
Vermont Natural Resources Council and so
Right.
forth.
Okay, so we have 1 minute and 18 seconds. Could you tell us all the cool things that are happening, particularly the roving photo contest thing? That's great. Why don't you tell us about that?
Well, how about I'll tell that and you talk about the film
About
event
the
that's
film,
coming up.
that's great.
So there's a photo competition to who come up with the most beautiful bird photos, and it's a national competition. The photos are amazing. Look for news of events both in Burlington and in Montpelier in January.
Excellent, thank you. And the movie?
Yep, so the end of the month, we are doing a film screening at Main Street Landing of a film called The Natural History of Vermont that looks at the landscape of Vermont in all seasons. And in addition to the film, we're going to be having an opening reception where folks can come, meet all of Audubon's staff and board, ask us questions about the work that we do, the education, the conservation, and the policy work we do.
Awesome.
So we'd love
November
to-
28th.
Yes.
Yes, that's coming up.
Yep.
So thank you both for coming.
Thank you so
I really
much.
Thank you.
enjoyed this.
Wonderful
and
conversation.
Eric, thank you for joining us.
Thanks so much.
So
Appreciate your time.
we've got things to think about. Where did you say you go to them on the Maple? They have
Oh,
a
Sugar and
Maple
Snow
Open
Parties.
House
Snow.
weekend.
My favorite food group.
Yeah.
Sugar and snow parties.
Yeah,
Yep,
exactly.
every year.
We had people visiting from Arizona. We were trying to explain what sugar on snow was, and they were slightly fascinated.
just gotta
Especially
go
when
do
you
it.
say you serve it with donuts and
A pickle,
And
absolutely.
that blew their minds. Anyway, thank you for tuning in. We'll see you next week, and in the meantime, keep listening beyond the sound bites.